Hi, welcome back to the channel and another video. So today I'm back again giving you another top 10 list, this time giving you my choices for my top 10 most underrated horror movies. So recently I did do a horror hidden gems list, which a lot of you guys seem to really enjoy. Really appreciate all the feedback on that video. So that's a little bit different because that was talking about movies that I think just lacked awareness. Not a lot of people know about them. I was kind of wanting to put them out there as recommendations. Whereas this list are all going to be very well-known films, but these are ones where there seems to be a large discrepancy between how much I love these films and how you guys, the audience, and also critics as well, seem to have received them. These either had bad reviews or mixed responses, or generally just don't get enough of praise, in my opinion. So all of these movies, highly underrated in my opinion. But as always, guys, please do let me know down in the comments what your picks are for the most underrated horror movies out there, and also let me know what you think of my choices as well. So I said this is a top 10. It's actually technically going to be a top 11 because there was one movie that was a little bit on the fence about including, because a lot of people actually really do love this movie now. Kind of over the years it's garnered a lot more love, and that is George A. Romero's 1985 Day of the Dead, the finishing part to his original Of the Dead trilogy. And I just watched this for the first time recently, and as I said, it does seem now like a lot more people really love this movie, but I'm amazed that it's never talked about as being the same caliber, on the same level as Night and Dawn of the Dead. Because I think this is a really fantastic conclusion to that original trilogy. And I think in a lot of ways it's maybe even better. I think it's a little bit richer with the themes that it's delving into, a little bit more detailed. I love the whole atmosphere of the film and the way it kind of talks about this conflict between the military kind of group who have taken over and the conflict between them and the scientists trying to get control of everything. I thought was really interesting, really well done. A lot of very good dialogue in this movie that gives food for thought. And in terms of it just being a great zombie movie as well, I think the special effects in this film are a massive step up from everything in Night of the Living Dead and also Dawn of the Dead. Some of the work that Tom Savini did in this film is absolutely amazing. And yeah, moves at a breakneck pace, and it's just a great zombie movie. And I've always skipped over this one before and only watched the first two because I heard it just wasn't on that same level, and I have to completely disagree with that. But as I say, it was on this list. I was kind of unsure about putting it on the list just because people do have actually really come around to this movie over years. It's got a lot more physical release and everything now, but yeah, brilliant zombie movie. This to me is a real classic of the zombie genre, and this whole trilogy is on a par in my opinion. So fantastic zombie movie, and definitely up there with the first two. Okay, getting into the proper top 10 now, starting off here at number 10 with Event Horizon. Now this is an interesting one because anybody that's been following my channel since the start will know I did review this movie very early on, and I did actually give it quite a mixed review myself. And it's interesting because it's one of those movies that I've seen a number of times over the years, and I do think it is quite a flawed film. It was kind of infamous for a lot of studio meddling and problems, and a lot of people want to see that director's cut because they cut out a lot of footage, and you can clearly see this movie has been messed with somewhat. But it's one of those films that despite the flaws, I find myself always talking about it, always wanting to revisit it, and always wanting to recommend it to people. And I think I was far too harsh in my review of it. And I think it's just now that I'm doing a channel, I'm watching more movies than I ever have before in my life. And it's movies like Event Horizon that really stick in my mind. A lot of movies I watch, I think they're decent, but they kind of fade over time, and there's nothing about them that really make a huge mark with me. Whereas something like Event Horizon, it's very distinct in its style. It's kind of blend of sci-fi and horror. It's really well done. A lot of people have said it's like Hellraiser in space, which I think is a great way to describe it. And I just think it's a really interesting movie despite its flaws. And I kind of am finding now that I really appreciate that in film. So this definitely comes as an underrated pick for me. I think despite its problems and its flaws, it's actually a really good film and definitely worth checking out for fans of the genre. And for me, it is easily the best film that Paul W.S. Anderson has ever made. Number 9 here, I've got the House of Wax remake from 2005. And I actually really like this film. Again, this is another one that I hadn't watched. I kind of put off watching it because of how bad all the kind of review scores for this were online. This only got a 28% positive score on Rotten Tomatoes, and I just think that's completely unfair on this movie. I think it's actually a very nicely done slasher film with a good atmosphere, good tension, great sequences, and it's quite ambitious in a few spots. And I just don't understand the issue with this movie. You know, if you don't like moody slasher films in this time period, you know, in the early mid-2000s, you know, they did have a particular distinct style about them, I think. And, you know, the teenage characters, of course, are of that time as well. So if you just don't like that kind of stuff, I understand. But in comparison to other good slasher films of that era, I think this one easily stands up there with those. And I think it was just the expectations going in when I first watched this. I was kind of the whole way through thinking, what's wrong with this movie? This is actually really good. I was really enjoying myself. I think it's a dark, well-made slasher film, and I just really don't see people's issue with this. I think one of the things it was dunked on for was, of course, having Paris Hilton in the cast. But even she's pretty good. Like, she doesn't stand out to me as anything bad for this type of horror movie, I don't think. You know, the calibre of acting at this level is never usually that standout. They just have to kind of do what they need to kind of fit into the vibe of the movie and not stand out like a sore thumb. And I think she does a nice job with that. Her kill sequence as well is really well done as well, I thought. So I have no problems with this movie. I really quite enjoy this one. I think for slasher fans, highly recommend this one. I don't know how it compares to the remake, in all fairness, because I've never seen the original, but as a horror movie in itself, the bad ratings for this one, in my opinion, are completely unjustified. Okay, number 8, I'm going with a Suspiria remake from 2018. I noticed there is a little bit of a pattern of remakes in this. I'm not as hard on remakes, I don't think, as some people tend to be. But the Suspiria remake stands out to me as being a much better film than the original. And, you know, a great film in its own right as well. And the consensus online seems to be the other way around. I have to be honest, I'm one of those people that finds the work of Dario Argento a little bit overrated. You know, he's kind of one of the big names in horror from Italy. Of course, made a lot of very iconic horror films from the 70s and 80s. And I think his films are okay. I think they're okay at best. And Suspiria was one that I was really looking forward to. And I just left it just not really feeling anything about it, to be honest. And then I heard the remake was even worse. So it did take me a little bit of time to get round to this. But the remake for me, I think, is a much deeper film. I think the themes are much better fleshed out. The characters are more well developed. I think it's got a better atmosphere to it. There's something far more intriguing about the whole way the plot is playing out. Whereas, you know, Suspiria, the original Suspiria, I feel like it's a lot of those striking visuals kind of telling the story rather than the depth of the story and the characters. Whereas the remake takes a slightly different approach to that, and it's something that just works for me a lot more. Of course, very talented director with Luca Guadagnino, sorry, I can never pronounce his name, but I think he's a really good director, and I think the finale in particular is really pretty standout. It packs quite a punch. It's really quite horrific. It's very explosive. You don't see it coming, and it's just much more wilder and memorable, I think, than the original. Like the original in particular, I thought, well, you know, it's been a slow build, but maybe they've got a big finale in store with us that's going to really stick with me. And it just doesn't have that. The whole experience of that film was very underwhelming to me. So I don't think people actually dislike the Suspiria remake, but it's definitely seen as the inferior remake to the first film, whereas I have a completely different experience with this one. I think the remake of Suspiria is a pretty fantastic horror movie. Okay, next up at 7, we've got M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. A bit of a controversial director. I know he's a very love-hate for a lot of people. Has had some great movies out there and had a lot of duds as well, no doubt. I think pretty much everyone can agree on that. But The Village is one, to me, that I've always really enjoyed, and I've never understood the hate for this film. I think The Village, it's the twist in particular, I think, that people mainly have an issue with. And I have to say, I just think people have jumped on the bandwagon a little bit with this, because I watched it again fairly recently, and the twist really works for me. I think it's quite inventive, quite unique, unexpected as well. I really didn't call what was kind of going on within this community. And yeah, I just thought it was a really interesting idea, and the reason for why. I'm not going to spoil it here because I want you to see the film if you haven't. But yeah, the reason for why they've kind of set up this community and why everything is the way it is, I thought really works. So when people say it's kind of a laughably bad twist, that just does not resonate with me at all. And this is definitely, for me, one of the better M. Night films. I mean, Sixth Sense is definitely my favourite. But I think The Village is probably his most underrated film. It's the one from him where it's probably most of his films that people don't like, I tend to agree on for the most part. Even when I kind of have some guilty pleasure enjoyment with them, I'm like, yeah, I understand why people don't like The Happening, why people don't like Lady in the Water, for example. But The Village is one of those that I think is genuinely a very well done movie. And it is a slow burn, it's a film about the atmosphere, it slowly develops, it takes a few unpredictable directions. But for me, it really works. So this is definitely the one that I seem to have an opinion that goes against the majority, because I think The Village is one of the best M. Night films. Okay, number 6, I'm going with Jeepers Creepers. And this is obviously a difficult one to talk about now, because a lot of the hate from this movie, of course, comes from the fact that the director has been in a lot of trouble for some very serious crimes in the past. And I can definitely understand not being able to separate the art from the artist. It's definitely weird to think about now when you're watching a film directed by someone like that. But as for the film itself, I think people are also quite critical of this film. When just talking about the movie in itself, I think this is one of the best creature horror films that's ever been made. I think it's very creative, very unique, and it just, again, it's another movie that really stands out to me. A little bit like what I was saying with Event Horizon, like the whole story and plot of this film and the way it's handled, it just stands out in my mind. I want to go back and revisit it and talk about it to people, despite the few flaws that it does have. And I do think in particular the first half of the film, just in setting up within a very intriguing premise of this brother and sister out on the road on a big open road for all these empty fields, and they see a figure in a dark cloak dumping bodies down this pipe, and you have no idea why or what's going on. They're both terrified and intrigued, and the movie just straight off the bat pulls you right in, and it just absolutely flies by because you're gripped by everything that's going on. So it's a real standout horror film to me, and I wish they made more. I wish there was more movies out there like this. I think a lot of movies follow kind of a more generic plot. Even, in my wheelhouse with horror movies that I really like, whereas this, to me, it did something very different. And, whilst I do think it is flawed at times, especially in the second half, I think it loses a little bit of steam, but overall, to me, I do think this is one of the standouts in horror, and definitely from the 2000s when it came out, easily one of the best. Okay, number 5, I've got The Burning. This is a slasher film from 1981, and I think this movie actually is quite liked by people who enjoy their 80s slasher films, but the interesting thing about this film is it just never had the staying power that other slashers of its time did. Stuff like Friday the 13th, Halloween. Those movies are iconic now and spawned huge franchises and everything. And The Burning never did that. It was just kind of this lone slasher, came out and it went away. But I think in many ways, I think it's definitely a better film than the original Friday the 13th. But for me, I maybe even think it is up there with Halloween as well. I think this movie, for what it is, if this is in your wheelhouse as a slasher film, I think it creates a fantastic atmosphere. It is another camp slasher movie with a group of very attractive young people all together, kind of, hanging out and getting picked off one by one by a sadistic killer. It is a generic plot that you've seen time and time again in these type of movies, but I think every element of it is handled really well. The atmosphere is great. The sense of dread and foreboding of what is coming, I think, is really nicely handled. And I genuinely do find that before some of the kill sequences, I do feel that kind of slight sense of anxiety in me that other movies of that time just don't manage to get that response out of me. They're kind of, because they feel a lot tamer by nowadays standards, especially Friday the 13th. Whereas The Burning, to me, it just kind of really kind of fills you with that. It gives you that tense feeling where you're kind of slightly taken aback by what's coming, with some very surprising sequences. So I think this is a very good slasher film. I do think maybe it was let down by the final sequence. I think the killer, the motivations, it did kind of go a bit of a formulaic route. And obviously the design of that character was just maybe, again, not as iconic as, say, Jason Voorhees with a hockey mask and everything, but which is a shame because I actually think The Burning is one of the higher caliber levels of film in the slasher genre that came out in the 80s. So yeah, this is one that you missed out on and you're a fan of this the subgenre, 100% you need to get on watching The Burning. I think it's fantastic. Number 4, I've got It Comes at Night, and this is actually an interesting one because I think this movie's problems come from the fact that the trailers and the marketing kind of set expectations for the type of movie that it was going to be, and it really wasn't that at all. You know, it kind of looked like it was going to be this monster movie, you know, from the title, It Comes at Night, either a monster movie or an entity or something like that this family were going to have to fight off. And it's actually not the type of movie this is at all. Of course, this is about a family who are living out in isolation amid a pandemic of this unknown illness. And it's kind of showing the effects of cabin fever starting to set in, how you start to go a little bit crazy. When they also meet other people, they don't know who to trust. And it's a look into kind of paranoia that sets in this kind of situation when there aren't the usual rules we're used to living by in everyday life when there's uncertainty in the world. And I think it's a fascinating study of that handled in this movie. I thought it was really well done. I loved the actors in this movie. I thought they gave really convincing performances. You kind of felt for all of them and understood the situation. But yeah, there's something just very unsettling about the whole atmosphere and vibe of this film, and it just really worked for me. And it was interesting because I actually didn't watch this when it first came out. I watched it in the first week of the COVID lockdown. I was like looking up recommendations for films to watch about lockdowns. For some reason, I found it satisfying to look into films about that at the time, which is kind of strange. But this was a movie that came high up on that list, and I think just amid everything that was going on, something about the atmosphere of this movie I was just absolutely captivated by, and I think it is a genuinely very good film. And I think the kind of mixed and negative reviews and responses you see to this film online don't give credit to what a really well done film this actually is. So go in with different expectations, go in open-minded, and I really think there's something to be taken from this movie. Okay, so my number 3 choice is Alien 3, a little bit of a controversial one here. And again, this is another one like Event Horizon where I have talked about on the channel previously, and I've been quite mixed about the film, but it's another one that I always find myself intrigued to talk about and revisit, and I do think there is quite a lot of good in this movie despite its flaws. Of course, now the film is infamous for the huge amount of studio meddling from 20th Century Fox. David Fincher has effectively disowned the film as well, but I actually think the assembly cut that was put together for the later release of the movie is actually quite a good cut of the film despite its flaws. The first half in particular I think is a really interesting film with some really good, well fleshed out elements and a very intriguing story. I think there definitely is flaws in the second half, which I have talked about at length if you want to look further back on the channel. But the problem is, it's a huge step down from Alien and Aliens. You know, those two films are absolute classics of the science fiction and horror genre. Two of my favourite films of all time as well. So I understand why Alien 3 is a disappointment to so many people, myself included when I first saw it. What they decided to do, killing off two of the main characters from the previous film as well, was a very poor decision, especially the way they handled it as well. But I've just found on subsequent rewatches over the years, it's another film where I do just value a movie that makes me think, makes me want to go back and revisit it and talk about it. So I do really appreciate that about Alien 3 despite its numerous problems. Okay, number 2, another film that I know is going to be a bit of a controversial pick because so many people hate this movie as well, but that is the Nightmare on Elm Street remake. And I did actually talk about this film at length recently because I did a Nightmare on Elm Street series of reviews, went through all the films in depth. So if you want to hear my thoughts, I will link you to a review here if you want to hear me defend the movie. But I actually think this movie deserves a lot more credit than it gets. And I think there's elements about the film that are criticised which I just don't really understand. I do think in a lot of ways it explores the backstory of the kids and what they went through, and them kind of looking into their past in a way which the original didn't do. And I did appreciate it kind of going more in depth with that side of the story. Don't get me wrong, I think the original is an absolute classic. I love the original Elm Street, one of my favourite horror movies of all time. So it's nowhere near as good as the original, but I definitely don't think it's an awful film. I just think the things that people jump on criticising it for, I don't entirely agree with. You know, Rooney Mara's performance, I actually think works for someone who's kind of going through severe sleep deprivation and is kind of an outcast at this school. I think her performance is really good. Okay, it's maybe not the kind of enthusiasm you're used to seeing in her normal, like, later movies that she's done, but I still think she gives a suitable performance for this character. And as I say, a few of the themes that it delves into and talks about in this, I do think it kind of gets in a little bit further and is a bit of a richer film than some people have given it credit for. Of course, there are flaws with it. The CGI, it goes darker in places that I think were unnecessary, and I just don't think it has the charm and the... It's not as original as the first movie, of course. It kind of copies a lot of elements from it, and it does feel like a second-rate rip-off in some areas, but certainly not a terrible film. I watched it and I actually really enjoyed it. I think I gave it like a 7 out of 10. So I actually do think it's a good movie, and it is worth going into again open-minded, because I think it's probably one of the better films, I would say, in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And lastly, number 1, I've got the Evil Dead remake. And this is a film where I think more people have come around to it in recent years. And I say it's not one that's been negatively reviewed as such, but if you look on any site for it, it's easily got the lowest reviews or the lowest ratings out of the whole Evil Dead franchise. The first 3 movies are garnered as absolute classics. Of course, the first film is very iconic because of new techniques that Sam Raimi brought to it. And I love that film, don't get me wrong. But the remake does not get enough credit. I think it had a really interesting new idea of kind of bringing in the whole angle with the main character. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but the character of how she's going through this kind of drug withdrawal, and that's why they've taken her out to this cabin in order to detox and kind of go in with a fresh slate. And she starts kind of hallucinating and having a really hard time. And you believe that these characters basically are holding her there because that's just the withdrawal. But actually, this is the effects of, the Book of the Dead coming to them. So that kind of analogy they put in there, the whole thing about drug withdrawal, I just think it added a real bit of depth to the story that wasn't there previously. It wasn't just a zombie film. It had a little bit more, and I really liked the way the characters were done. That main character in particular, I thought was really well fleshed out, and I really liked the story there. And above that, as an Evil Dead movie, if you want an intense horror film with gnarly, gory horror sequences that keep you on the edge of your seat the whole way through, you cannot go wrong with this film. And I just think that finale as well is absolute insanity. Like the final 15 minutes of that film, you come away and you're just like, wow, what did I just watch? I think it's absolutely amazing, an incredible final sequence. So I do get that people love the originals and people have a lot of nostalgia, I'm sure, for those classic Evil Dead films. But to me, Army of Darkness being rated far above the Evil Dead remake, no way. I think the remake is a far better movie. So that is my final pick for one of the most underrated horror movies out there. So guys, that is my top 10 list for my picks of the most underrated horror movies out there. Let me know down in the comments if you agree with my choices. And of course, let me know your choices as well for the most underrated horror films in your opinion. So thanks so much for watching. Really do appreciate it as always. Do take care, and I'll see you next time.